Good morning and welcome to the second in the series of Responsible Pathways. Firstly, many thanks for you joining today. We've got a great audience and I really do appreciate your taking time out. And the event, I'm delighted to say, is truly fantastic. My name is Steve Kenny and I am the Chief Distribution Officer at Square Mile. My job today is to guide you through the first part of the event. And it's hard to believe it's only been 4 weeks since our first event in this series. And what a 4 weeks we've had. Just prior to our first event, we saw the UK government publish the Greening Finance paper, which set out in 48 pages a roadmap to sustainable investing. And in the very final pages, probably one of the most important statements for you advisors was there would be encouragement. A key aim will be to ensure that they, i.e. advisors, take sustainability matters into account in their investment advice and understand investors' sustainability preferences to ensure suitability of advice, which undoubtedly is trailblazing the adoption of some form of suitability requirements for UK advisors, which is where your counterparts in Europe will be from 2022. We then had 2 weeks of COP26, where the need for change was given a thorough public airing. Then last week, we had the first discussion paper that was mentioned in the Greening Finance document, sustainability disclosure requirements and investment labels, which will be coming into force during 2022. So a really traumatic couple of weeks. Now, you do have the facility today to submit questions, and I would encourage you to do so. We have a fantastic panel, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. Firstly, today's agenda. We kick off with 2025 predictions, and we hear from Elgin, Invesco, and Newton Investment, part of BNY. We then have the highly respected LANCAST talking about their observations that they hear from you, the advisor community, on responsible investing. I will then introduce questions from the road, and more about that in a minute. We then have 360, the leading independent financial services compliance business, on what they are hearing from advisors and how they are guiding them in this area. The final part of today will be conducted by my colleague Anna Mercer, a responsible investment consultant here at Square Mile. We'll take control of a panel of excellent speakers from Elgin, Invesco, and Newton. We'll then close. The event does qualify for CPD, and we'll be delighted to supply you with certificates. We would welcome your feedback, and please do complete the questionnaire on responsible investment. Now, before I kick off, I wanted to thank our sponsors, without whom today's event would not be responsible. So thank you to Aegon, AXA, BNY Mellon, Invesco, Jupiter, Elgin, Natixis, Aberdeen, Federated Hermes, JP Morgan Asset Management, 91, Schroders, and T. Rowe Price. Now, without further ado, we'll go into the predictions for 2025.
Predicting where we think the world will be in 2025 is not easy. But there are three things I'd like to maybe flag. The first is that I think by 2025, everyone will know that 80 to 90% of their clients are ESG or sustainable clients. Currently, only 10% of assets in the UK are invested in such a fashion, but I think there is going to be increased reality that everybody cares about sustainability. And the second point I want to make is that people are going to understand that changing your pension is one of the most effective ways to have greater influence. Make My Money Matters, a great campaign that's running, is demonstrating that moving your pension is 21 times more effective than becoming vegan, never flying again, on your carbon footprint. And once people understand the power of their money and their pensions in influencing the world at large, people are only going to demand greater focus. And the third element is that net zero is going to become increasingly important and part of everybody's lexicon. And I think it's going to have a fundamental change in terms of the investment management industry. in that we as an industry, having been focused only on delivering profits, are now being asked to deliver risk, return, and importantly, on responsibility. And that third dimension of investing is going to become an important factor for us as fund managers and for you as clients.
By 2025, we believe the world is likely to find itself in one of the three central climate scenarios we use in our analysis. Two involve emissions continuing to rise, the first in a business as usual trajectory, the second in a more disorderly pathway. The third sees the world taking determined logical steps to reduce emissions at a rate fast enough for an outcome consistent with the Paris Accord. The success of events like the recent climate conference COP26 in Glasgow will provide some insights into the willingness of world leaders to focus on the third pathway. Under each scenario, further volatility in energy markets is probable. 2021 clearly has offered a taste of things to come. The energy transition will also likely involve large government deficits as carrots, as well as significant industry disruption from sticks. There's a non-trivial risk of recession if this is mismanaged. At the same time, we anticipate even greater demand from investors for their asset managers to incorporate ESG considerations in everything they do. ESG integration in the investment decision-making process will be standard instead of a nice to have. In addition to climate, the themes of biodiversity, nutrition, and the circular economy will continue to rise in prominence. We also expect and hope to see stronger harmonization in the policy and regulatory space, as well as further improvements in ESG data along the investment chain.
I predict that by 2025, governments around the world will begin mandating that corporates use science-based targets to address climate change. The reason for this is that while there have been lots of commitments around net zero around the world, real-world emissions are expected to continue to increase over the next 10 years due to wealth increases in emerging markets, COVID reopening, and the lack of affordable emission-reducing technologies that can operate at scale right now. As we get closer to 2030, the gap between the scientific requirements and the reality of emission increases will become too difficult to continue to paper over with long-term commitments. This will drive greater levels of state intervention in the markets as governments try to balance rectifying the market failure to price pollution while continuing the secure supply of affordable inputs into key processes within the economy. This type of intervention will be positive for corporates who have moved early and voluntarily adopted this approach, and for companies that are innovating the technologies that will enable a faster transition.
Now, there were some really interesting predictions there. I think one of the key takeaways I took was the importance of the role the advisor has to play. It was emphasized in that clip and reinforces a point made in the first event where Research in Finance stated the consumer trusted advisors in this area, but there was suspicion of the integrity of the propositions offered by the asset managers. And therefore, the role of the advisor becomes ever more important in this particular area. Now, I'm delighted to say we have Mike Barrett from the LANCAST, who's going to share 3 points from their really recent survey, so very fresh material, of advisors on this area. Mike, over to you.
Hello, Michael Barrett from the LANCAST. I want to spend some time talking about some of our research which we do with advisors. For those of you who aren't aware of what we get up to at the LANCAST, we do a mixture of research, consulting, PR and communications with financial services firms, and we spend a large part of our time talking to financial advisors, specifically around what's going on in their business, and also sending out surveys, getting loads of research. It's probably not a day that doesn't go by when we're not in contact of some way, shape or form with advisors. And a large part of this focuses on platforms, technology, and the types of investments which they're using with their clients. So specifically in the area of responsible investing, I wanted to kind of share 3 kind of themes and thoughts which we've gathered over our recent travels. So first up, looking at some of our initial research, and all of this stuff, I'm pleased to say, is hot off the press actually. So we've had our biggest survey of the year out with advisors in recent weeks. So these are fresh insights, kind of giving us kind of a real kind of current view of what advisors are up to. So one of the questions we asked in terms of responsible investing and the kind of the wider theme of ESG is how many clients are advisors seeing where the client is proactively raising the subject themselves rather than kind of off the back of a prompt with the advisor. Answer we get from advisors is 14% in terms of a mean average, 10% in terms of the mode. So 1 in 10 clients are raising that conversation themselves. So there is some demand out there, but it tends to be a little bit more kind of the kind of the increased flows we've seen into those solutions and investments tend to be kind of more off the back perhaps of the advisor starting to stimulate the conversation themselves, probing the questions themselves, or even suggesting solutions themselves, rather than necessarily the clients proactively asking for it. As I mentioned a moment ago, this survey was conducted in recent weeks, but so perhaps hasn't picked up kind of the potential surge of interest we might see off the back of COP26 and certainly the wall-to-wall coverage we've seen on this topic in the last few weeks. Advisors, as I said, the kind of their interest in this, the flows in this are starting to kind of match initially the demand from their customers. We ask them if they estimate how do they think this is going to evolve, and as you would expect, they're expecting these flows to increase quite dramatically over the next 5 years. So most firms are expecting to be putting at least 60-70% of their flows into responsible investing in 5 years' time. But I think generally the advice community is feeling rather underserved in terms of demand, in terms of kind of the architecture and the regulation and the support they need to be able to have these conversations with their customers and to make suitable recommendations. So in terms of regulation, it's actually quite interesting for a lot of advisors, as you would expect, when we ask them should there be more regulation in this sector for suitability, so requiring advisors to ask questions around suitability for ESG and responsible investing. Quite a few advisors said they'd rather have they'd like that, like if they want a hole in their head. But do you know what? Quite a few advisors actually would see that as a positive step. So at the moment, it's kind of fairly abstract, and they're left up to their own devices, really. So in the absence of kind of clear regulatory guidance or even rules as to what they should be doing, it's all a little bit vague for advisors. I think they like perhaps the comfort of the process and the regulator telling them exactly what to do. And we've seen that in the last few days with the regulator putting out a discussion paper to kind of kick off this process of ensuring some of the labelling on investments are improved, and in turn what that might mean for the advice process. We get quite a few comments from advisors around data and the inconsistency of data and data sources. And I think that's a fairly well understood issue that does need to be worked through and addressed by those particular suppliers. But ultimately, we asked advisors who is responsible for this, who's really going to kind of change the dynamic and hit some of the targets which have been talked about in the last few days. Around about a third of advisors see it as their responsibility, their role to make sure that investments are investing in a responsible and a sustainable way and addressing all of the issues around climate change, etc. But actually 40% of advisors, so a larger proportion, see that responsibility as being held by the asset managers, the investment managers, rather than necessarily just the advisor defining it themselves. So that leads me onto my second point, really. So as well as researching what's happening in responsible investing, we ask loads of questions consistently to advisors about what's happening in their business, around how they're writing investment business, the type of processes they're using generally for investments, irrespective of what type of investment strategy they're adopting. For the last few years, we've seen these responses dominated by a centralized investment proposition. So it's extraordinarily rare now that you'll find an advice firm, certainly one of any scale, that will be running anything other than a centralized investment proposition. Around about 9 out of 10 firms in our survey come back and say, yeah, that's what we've got in place. Within that cohort, it's roughly 50-50 as to whether they're doing it all in-house themselves, so building their own portfolios, using research tools, constructing it all themselves, or they're outsourcing to a third-party discretionary manager, mixing and matching perhaps between the two as well. And we've seen that trend to outsourcing gradually increasing over the last 3 or 4 years, and particularly off the back of MiFID II, which made it a lot harder to be running your own model portfolios. So I think we're taking it back to kind of responsible investing, and actually probably indeed any type of investing. The question for kind of the regulators and also the manufacturers and people wanting to sell these products into advice firms is actually who are the decision makers here? Who are the gatekeepers? It might be where you've got a firm who are picking their own funds for their portfolios and running them on an advisory basis. So that's where you can have a conversation with the advice firm and start to influence them to adopt your way of thinking, to invest into your portfolios, into your funds. But if the advice firm is actually outsourcing to a third party, to a discretionary manager, then you maybe need to go upstream and have that conversation with the discretionary manager themselves. And also the impact then of model portfolios. So the vast majority of the solutions, or an increasing amount of these solutions we're seeing, are going into pure model portfolios. So there might be hundreds of clients invested into the same portfolio. And I just wonder, and again, the advisors we speak to about kind of how ESG and responsible investing might evolve, the kind of the increased requirements there for something that's very personalized and perhaps very subjective, and people's thinking might evolve over time, how that might work in an environment at the moment where model portfolios dominate and a lot of clients end up invested in the same thing. You overlay that then potentially with regulation and the consequences of not making a suitable investment on behalf of your clients. Yeah, is this model portfolio going to be completely suitable for your client, or might there be something invested in there which over time the client might decide that actually they didn't like, it doesn't meet their requirements? So I think we might start to see over time a kind of an evolution in how these models adopt, and more kind of an increased frequency of advisors adopting and kind of starting to personalize, go off piste and build maybe more bespoke solutions to really address and account for individual client preferences, individual client needs. My third point takes us back to our kind of our safe home, if you like, at the LANCAST, an area which we spent a lot of time looking at, and that's the world of platforms. I think actually there's an argument that platforms have dodged a bit of a bullet with the whole ESG and responsible investing debate at the moment. Obviously, platforms are there to facilitate investments into investment solutions, and it's absolutely right that the focus of the conversation should be initially with the advice part of the sector and with the asset managers, the manufacturers building these solutions. But as I said, I think there is a role for the platforms to play in this. There's certainly a role, I think, for them to collect and distribute some of the information as and when the FCA's requirements for increased disclosure and reporting come through. I think the platforms in a lot of cases will be very well placed to facilitate some of that. The challenges we talked about data a moment ago, the platforms need to perhaps be part of a solution within that. But I just wonder if the theme of ESG becomes as relevant and as commonplace as most people seem to think it will do over the coming years. If your client is expressing a real interest in investing this particular way, chances are the advisor will have said to them, this is how we run our business and how we have run a sustainable business, a responsible business. They'll be picking an investment solution which will match those needs. But it does raise the question about the platform as well. So, is my platform operating in a way which I want them to? And I guess you can break down the E, the S, and the G to look at different elements of that. So, for example, on the environmental side, we've seen a real increase over the last 18 months of platforms being able to operate much more remotely in a paper-free manner with digital signatures, and a lot of them kind of being brought kicking and screaming up to the 21st century and adopting technology very, very rapidly. And that's now become commonplace. There's not many platforms where they don't have that type of functionality, albeit in some cases it's still kind of a short-term kind of COVID solution rather than maybe a long-term strategic solution which they built. You look at the social side of things. A good example would be AJ Bell in this sector, where last year they got a lot of positive coverage for some of the statements they were putting out about how they were treating their people, both employed through AJ Bell in the business in Manchester and the wider community as well there. So making sure that people were supported through the pandemic. Again, a really good kind of firm ticking the box for the social side of things, if that's what is interesting the investors. And then governance, strong governance has always been something which advisors have been selecting and assessing as part of their platform due diligence as well. To an extent, it's business as usual for a lot of platforms, but the theme of kind of business continuity, service continuity, and how committed a platform is to the market, and what might happen if their ownership changes, all of those kind of governance questions is, again, quite important to advisors when we speak to them about their platform due diligence and how they're selecting platforms to work with and to use with their clients. So I just think platforms might have to start to kind of come into this conversation, partly because I think some of them will see it as a good opportunity. They'll be really strong in the area and they'll want to get out and talk to advisors and to their clients about it. But also some of them might have a bit of demand as well from the clients. If a client is really saying, yes, I want to have my investments invested in a company which is displaying strong ESG credentials, then I think the platform has to be part of the answer there, which the client is presented by the advisor. That's it for me. I hope you found that useful. If you have, my contact details are on the website. If you haven't, my contact details are on the website. So feel free to send me an email either way. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mike. That was some excellent feedback. And we would certainly echo the feedback from Mike and the team at LANCAST about advisors are keen to have some form of regulatory guidance on this. There is a concern in that community that moving too soon may put them in regulatory hot water rather than being seen taking on a best endeavours approach. So, regulatory guidance would be appreciated. We now turn to questions from the road. At Square Mile, we have 5 members of the team who regularly meet advisors. And today we have Sophie Martin, who is a member of the team, who is asking 4 asset management experts the questions that she has received during her time out seeing advisors. Our experts today are from AXA, Jupiter, Aegon, and Natixis. So without further ado, over to Sophie and her questions.
Hello, I'm Sophie Martin, Business Development Manager at Square Mile, and today I will be asking our sponsors a number of questions that we often hear raised when talking to our clients about responsible investment. As a result of COP26, do you see an increased focus on climate moving forward that could overshadow all other aspects of responsible investment?
To be honest, I wish there actually was a greater focus on climate. I think that's for something that's such a grave and obvious danger to the future of the planet. Globally, we sort of seem to be doing more avoiding and less acting. And, I think everything related to our society, so not just the economy, but everything, is predicated on a stable climate. And so something like, catastrophic and unmitigated climate change would make, I think, most, if not all, of other aspects of responsible investment in ESG sort of irrelevant, right? It's kind of unfortunate, but there's a quote I remember reading, and it says, "Drowned cities and ruined croplands aren't exactly good for business." So that's why, to me, I think climate action is really critical. So I would welcome an increased focus on climate, and I think in light of COP and everything that's happening, I think that has to start with governments. Governments have to set the policies and programs to deliver on the promises that they've made over time since the Paris Agreement, and set the framework and the ground rules for the private sector to begin to mobilize and make the necessary changes and investments required to actually transition us to a net zero economy, reduce emissions and achieve the global climate goals.
There seems to be a lot of discussion about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but how are they used in relation to stock analysis?
The UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, represent a clear framework of goals designed to end poverty and protect the planet, ensure peace and prosperity for all. They are supported by granular targets, each of which requires capital, creating a role for investors. Each goal reflects an area of unmet need. In many cases, existing technology and innovation has the potential to contribute progress. This means the suppliers of solutions have an opportunity both to grow and to deliver positive impact. As investors, there is an opportunity to create strategies which seek to deliver positive impact alongside conventional financial returns. And this is an area in which we see a growing interest from clients. The SDGs offer a framework through which we can structure a universe to identify businesses with the potential to deliver impact. In conjunction with a clear impact framework, we use SDGs to measure and compare companies' contribution. Where there is the potential for improvement, we can use them as a yardstick for engagement, using the specific targets as a basis for communication with management teams around the world and a basis upon which to set targets and measure the progress of our engagement. Finally, we can use the SDGs to report to our clients. If we set out to achieve a positive impact for our clients, it's important that we're able to demonstrate our performance in this regard. The SDGs form a useful basis around which we can communicate with clients and through which our clients can compare us with our peers and their own priorities. And so for all of these reasons, I think the SDGs provide a useful common framework of priorities with regard to the positive impact that we need to achieve.
Greenwashing is an ongoing concern within the industry. How are you addressing this?
The way that we approach this is by providing our clients and investors with evidence and transparency of how we apply our investment framework and what the real world outcomes look like. And we do this through an annual impact report. So every single investor in our fund can understand exactly how their savings support the transition to a more sustainable world. And we report on three core stakeholders: the planet, on which we all depend, the people with whom we all coexist, and the profit that we require from our long-term savings. We think this is an important tool for investors to understand. What I would also say is that we are very nascent in the journey of accounting for sustainability outcomes. There is currently a lot of complexity and nuance that we have to consider when providing that evidence and transparency. And we go to great lengths to provide that to our clients, and some of the balance that we have to consider in the context of broader stakeholder outcomes, and that is there provided in our annual impact report. What I would also say is that we make a commitment at a firm level. We have dual footprints as investors. We have those of our investments in companies, but we also have a footprint at a firm-wide level, and committing our house to decarbonisation through the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and to broader social goals in the context of Good Work Coalition and living wage commitments, and also adhering to the UN Global Compact principles, is a key determinant for aligning our firm-wide interests with our investment outcomes in the context of sustainability.
What is sustainability and what does it mean to your firm?
Sustainability is generally defined as meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, Mirova is by French law a mission-driven company and also B Corp certified. And that means that, our impact on sustainability for all of our actions are always taken into account. Be it now through our own processes, but also through the products that we offer to our clients as well. In terms of our investment products, be it now equities, bonds, private equity, or unlisted infrastructure, not only do we take sustainability information into account and integrate that to better or achieve better financial performance, but each of those products also have a social or environmental performance target as well.
Thank you. Now, I hope you found those of interest. A couple of you have emailed in on the questions and asked about the comment that Clive made in his predictions on 2025. He mentioned a quote about 2025 and the effect that your pension could have in terms of changing the investment. That Clive reference was from Make My Money Matters videos that are on YouTube. And there is a selection of those on YouTube, and I would encourage you, if you've not already seen them, to have a look. They are really very valid in terms of financial statements and giving you the ammunition to talk to clients about the effect and the benefits that your money can make in changing the world we live in. Now, my final part today is to introduce Julie Hardy, Head of Research and Policy Consultant at 360, which is widely regarded as the leading compliance consultancy business in the UK for financial advisors. Julie will share what they are hearing from advisors and how they are providing practical help in this area. After Julie's session, my colleague Anna will be taking over and chairing the panel, where we have 3 superb speakers. I would encourage you to submit questions and take the opportunity to hear their valuable insights in what's going on in this particular marketplace. Julie, over to you.
Hi, I'm Julie Hardy and I'm Head of Research at 360 Services, where I'm responsible for the delivery of centralised research and due diligence support for financial advisors, and that's delivered primarily through the 360 website. I also get involved in some policy work, which means reviewing FCA papers to help identify and highlight upcoming regulatory changes that might impact our clients, and recently this has included some of the FCA's work on ESG. Today, I'll be talking about the challenges we see our clients facing in the area of ESG and responsible investing. While I have some of my own views through the work I do, much of what I'm covering today is also informed by our team of business risk consultants who spend the majority of their time with our clients, helping them to identify and work through some of their biggest business challenges. So they're in a really good position to understand the latest issues and themes and how they're being addressed. I'll start with one of the primary challenges we're still seeing, and that is confusion over what UK advisors need to do. There has been quite a lot of noise in the UK financial press about EU regulation and a suggestion or implication that advisors must consider ESG and responsible investment solutions to satisfy a regulatory requirement. Prior to Brexit, there was some talk of the SFDR, or Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, being automatically onshored into the UK. To be clear, this didn't happen, but the FCA are now starting to introduce some similar rules while considering what's happening in Europe and globally. The FCA are mindful that some firms operating in the UK are already subject to similar rules through their operations in Europe, and in the interest of time and consistency are keen to adopt a similar or collaborative approach where appropriate for the UK, rather than reinvent the wheel. So while the EU regulation is still relevant and the FCA is taking it into account, new rules are being introduced to the UK through the normal FCA consultation process, which obviously will take some time and will be communicated in the normal way through consultation and policy papers. This is something that we do keep an eye on at 360, and we communicate it through regulatory development news and features on our client portal. I'll take you through some of these changes in a moment. There was also some speculation prior to Brexit about the UK potentially introducing some fact-finding requirements for UK advisors, which would make it compulsory to ask clients about their ESG preferences and take these into account. So far, we haven't seen any specific plan from the FCA to introduce such a requirement in the UK, but the government's Green Finance Roadmap, published in October this year, confirms a consultation on this within the next 3 years. The FCA do seem to be taking a bottom-up approach by focusing first on ensuring investment solutions are appropriate for UK consumers through transparent and comparable disclosures and improved stewardship standards. So this doesn't mean that advisors don't need to consider available investment options. The direction of travel from the regulator is now much clearer, and we're already seeing a combination of product innovation and increased investor interest and awareness. So having appropriate investment solutions for those clients who are interested makes really good business sense. And if you haven't done so already, you should be looking at this area now. We'll cover some potential options later, but for now, we'll take a closer look at some specific areas of focus for the FCA in the UK. The first is stewardship. In April this year, the FCA issued an update on their approach to climate change and sustainable finance, in which they highlighted active investor stewardship as an important tool to support a net zero economy and promote wider sustainability objectives. I'll cover some of the FCA's measures in this area. The first is the UK Stewardship Code 2020, which sets stewardship standards for those investing money on behalf of UK savers and pensioners and those that support them. It applies to asset owners such as pension schemes and insurers, asset managers and service providers such as investment consultants and data providers. It aims to make investors more accountable to their clients and beneficiaries through a requirement to report on certain stewardship activities and outcomes in the four main areas of purpose and governance, investment approach, engagement, and exercising rights and responsibilities. Investors take part voluntarily by becoming signatories of the code, but the FCA does require UK authorised asset managers to report on whether or not they apply the code. The FCA consulted in 2019 on imposing further stewardship-related requirements on life insurers and asset managers, but decided against this at the time while firms adapted to the then new Shareholder Rights Directive, or SRD2, but they confirmed that they will continue to consider any further actions. The FCA also reaffirmed in its update on climate change and sustainable finance in April this year that they will continue to work closely with the FRC as firms continue to develop their stewardship strategies. SRD2 itself aimed to promote greater transparency of how asset managers and owners invest the money they look after and how they engage with the companies they invest in. It requires those investors to disclose their engagement policy and explain how their investment strategies contribute to investment performance. And a further action by the FCA on stewardship involved the introduction of a duty applying to independent governance committees, or IGCs. IGCs are the bodies responsible for overseeing the operation of workplace pension schemes, and these bodies must now consider and report on their firm's policies on environmental, social and governance issues and stewardship. Next is climate-related disclosures. The FCA's work on climate-related disclosures is all about promoting transparency of how firms are managing climate-related risks and opportunities. The FCA's aim is essentially for end consumers to be better informed, so they're able to make a better assessment of the investment options available, which will not only protect them from buying inappropriate or unsuitable products, but will also help them to hold their providers to account, leading to increased competition and improved market integrity. The FCA's measures in this space include the TCFT disclosures for listed companies. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, was established by the Financial Stability Board in 2015 to identify the climate-related information needs of the market and develop a set of climate-related disclosure recommendations. It published its report in 2017, setting out its recommended disclosures under the 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. From January this year, UK premium listed companies are now required to include a statement in their annual financial report stating whether they have made disclosures consistent with these recommendations or provide an explanation of why they haven't. In June this year, the FCA also consulted on extending this requirement to standard listed issuers, including debt securities, and that would be from January 2022. A policy statement confirmed the outcome is expected by the end of this year. Also in June this year, the FCA consulted on introducing TCFT disclosure requirements for asset managers and owners. Under the proposals, they'll be required to produce 2 sets of annual climate-related disclosures, one entity level explaining how the firm takes climate-related risks and opportunities into account, and then one at product or portfolio level, providing a comparable set of disclosures and metrics, focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, and carbon intensity. The firms in scope include fund managers, discretionary managers, and providers of insured investments and pensions and non-insured SIPs. At the same time, the DWP, or Department for Work and Pensions, have similar draft rules in place for occupational pension schemes and master trusts. So together that covers the broad spectrum of mainstream consumer products recommended by UK advisors. The aim is to introduce the FCA requirements using a phased approach, with the biggest firms publishing their first reports by June 2023 and the remainder a year later. And finally, for advisors, we're expecting to see some consultations next year, along with the introduction of some early accountancy rules for the largest firms. And this was mentioned in the UK government's Green Finance Roadmap published in October. The next area of focus is tackling greenwashing. The FCA delivered a speech in October last year, in which it highlighted its concerns around ESG or sustainable themed funds, including misleading fund names or claims about ESG credentials, unclear investment strategies, and a lack of measurement of non-financial performance against objectives, all of which make it difficult for consumers to assess the appropriateness or otherwise of these investments. Some of the previous points on enhancing climate-related disclosures are also relevant here, but in July this year, the FCA also published a letter to fund managers setting out its guiding principles or expectations for ESG and sustainable investment funds. In its letter, the FCA says that while it welcomes innovation and recognises that work is ongoing to improve ESG data and metrics, it wants to ensure consumer trust in the market isn't undermined in the meantime through poor quality design, delivery and disclosure of investment funds. The FCA makes it clear that its principles are not based on new rules, but are simply guidance to clarify its expectations in the context of ESG based on existing requirements, while further rules such as those on disclosures are developed. So, i.e., the expectation is that fund managers should already be taking this approach and will be required to do more later. The expectations are outlined through 4 principles. While these 4 principles apply to fund managers, they can also help inform the areas for advisors to consider when conducting research and due diligence on ESG funds. The first is an overarching principle of consistency, which states that a fund's ESG or sustainability focus should be reflected consistently in its name, objectives, investment policy and strategy, and its underlying holdings. 3 further principles then focus on specific areas of this. Principle 1 focuses on the design of the product and how this is disclosed, specifically that any mention of ESG or related terms in a fund's name, documentation or promotions should fairly reflect the fund's objectives, investment policy and strategy. Principle 2 focuses on the delivery of the product, looking for appropriate skills, experience, technology, data and analytical tools to be used in the pursuit of ESG objectives and for the underlying holders to reflect those objectives. Principle 3 focuses on disclosures, specifically the communication of ESG-related information in the KID and other supporting documents and marketing material, and on the quality and regularity of ongoing performance monitoring against the fund's stated objectives. I'll just briefly mention a few other initiatives the FCA are working on before moving on to some specific advisor challenges. As part of its work on climate-related disclosures, the FCA sought views on bringing ESG rating agencies, such as MSCI and Sustainalytics, within regulatory oversight in the UK. They didn't give any indication at that point of when we can expect feedback on that particular discussion, but they are clearly aware of the impact and influence these ratings can have and want to see consistency where they are used. In its discussion paper on diversity and inclusion published in July this year, the FCA mentions that the rise of ESG will help to keep diversity and inclusion at the forefront of the minds of boards, executives and staff, and that the FCA's own work on diversity and inclusion will be an important part of its wider engagement on ESG. And finally, the FCA confirmed that it would set out its proposed rules and guidance on climate-related disclosures for FCA-authorised firms in a new environmental, social and governance source book, and that it anticipates this expanding over time to cover wider ESG topics. So, as mentioned before, while the headline European regulation wasn't onshored into the UK, the FCA has been very active in this space, particularly over the last year, and the roadmap just published in October sets out the FCA plans for the next 3 years. So any UK advisors not already active in this area should be looking at it now. We'll now take a look at some specific challenges advisors are facing. I'll cover the 4 main challenges we hear about through our work with advisors. They haven't really changed that much in the last 12 to 18 months, although some of the solutions may have moved on a little. First up, some advisors are concerned that by instigating the discussion about responsible investing, they may be influencing the views of the client, that the client may feel morally obliged to say that of course they want to do the right thing, even if they don't really feel that strongly about it. To avoid overly influencing, it's important to start the conversation with an open discussion to identify general awareness of and interest in responsible investing, to see if it's something they're particularly interested in or already have experience of. And then depending on their response, you may or may not then be able to explore their views in more detail, such as through a standardised questionnaire that looks to identify specific granular preferences and the level of conviction, but this shouldn't be the starting point. You should also be prepared to educate interested clients and explain the various options that are starting to emerge in the market. For those who are unaware or unsure, it might be a good idea to just leave them with some information initially to consider in their own time, and then perhaps revisit the discussion at a later date. Those with a genuine interest should be fairly obvious through the line of questioning and general engagement. And don't forget that it's essential to document these discussions in some way, either through a file note or a questionnaire is fine, as long as it accurately reflects the client's views and the general outcome of the discussion and any next steps. Another challenge is managing clients with very strong conviction views about what they do and don't want to invest in. While there are some very useful research sources out there that can help identify funds investing in specific themes or with a specific exclusion approach, it's going to be difficult to find a solution that perfectly matches each client's personal preferences. The key here might be in finding options that provide a close fit, while also managing the client's expectations regarding the availability of investment options and the compromises versus the benefits of investing collectively to a relatively broad common objective. Again, it's important to ensure that these conversations are well documented and clearly reflect the client's own views. And for some clients, it might well be appropriate to refer them to a specialist discretionary service that can work to a bespoke mandate, identifying specific underlying companies that align with the client's very specific objectives and beliefs. We're seeing some firms reluctant to engage because they think they'll need to overhaul their centralised investment proposition, and they're not too keen to invest the time and resource at this point while the market is still developing, as they feel that they might need to change it all again later once there's a longer investment track record to consider and more consistency and transparency of reporting and measuring. While some firms are making a business decision to hold themselves out as specialists, creating their own model portfolios and targeting clients with a specific interest, we are seeing other firms providing an optional additional service for those clients who are interested, which complements their traditional approach without overhauling it. Some of the examples we've seen include having a panel of single strategy fund options available to use as alternatives to the default model portfolio funds in some sectors where appropriate. While this means that not every fund in the portfolio will be responsible or ESG, and not all asset classes may be responsibly managed, it does give the client the opportunity to achieve some exposure without completely redesigning the approach. For clients wanting to support a particular initiative, we've seen some firms allocating a proportion of the overall investment into one or more themed strategies, such as clean energy or water, with the remainder going into the traditional KIP. And there's a growing range of multi-asset funds and discretionary model portfolios available, including risk-managed options where you can choose the fund or portfolio from the range that most closely fits the client's risk profile. These generally cater to those clients who want to do some good, but without dictating specific themes and exclusion categories. Approaches will vary, so it's important to understand the manager's objectives, policy and strategy, and to manage expectations with the client regarding likely underlying holdings, but they can provide a good off-the-shelf solution for a segment of the client bank and can be made available alongside your traditional KIP. Finally, we see advisors wanting to know how to appraise the success or otherwise of these investment options and how to hold the managers to account on the claims they make. The work the FCA are doing around disclosures and guiding principles, which I covered earlier, aims to provide a framework that supports this. So do keep an eye on policy being brought in, and in the meantime, our guidance is to take a best endeavours approach. Primarily, this means asking the investment managers themselves to demonstrate how their policy and strategy is aligned to the investment objectives and other claims through specific reporting and examples. Some of the examples you could ask for include sites of their specific policies, examples of where they're documented and how they're adopted within processes such as investment selection and company engagement. Demonstration of experience and track record through adoption of quality codes, engagement with industry peer groups or the regulator, and the impact they feel this has on the management of the fund. Examples of research and other resources they use to inform their investment decisions. Commentary on the underlying holdings and examples of specific investment decisions, either positive or negative. For those investing directly, examples of engagement with underlying companies and use of voting rights. And finally, examples of how they themselves monitor or report on adherence to the stated objectives, policy and strategy. So this might be part of their own internal governance approach, or they might already be producing the TCFT recommended disclosures covered previously or similar. And this could be because they already produce these for their European market, so it's relatively straightforward operationally to report into the UK too, or they might just be ahead of the UK rules to maintain a competitive advantage. Finally, I'll quickly cover how we at 360 can support advisors with some of these challenges. Most of what I've covered today is also available as online guidance through our portal, and that includes the ongoing FCA proposals on ESG that I've talked about today and which will continue to follow. We have a range of related templates and questionnaires to help with your advice processes and your research and due diligence. You can pick up the phone and talk through some of your thoughts and plans, and we have a team of dedicated consultants who can help. We have a package of online learning and CPD-able training and events, including modules on ESG and responsible investing. And finally, we provide centralised research and due diligence on discretionary managers and multi-asset fund managers, including those with an ESG or responsible focus, plus information about other research tools and specialists who might be able to support. So that's it from me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Julie, for your brilliant and thorough overview of the common challenges facing advisors when it comes to ESG and responsible investment and the potential solutions. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the final session of this event. My name is Anna Mercer, and I'm a responsible investment analyst at Square Mile Research. For the next 40 minutes, we will be focusing on the topic of how businesses are evolving to become more responsible, considering issues like what that actually means, how we can identify them, and the role of engagement. To unpick this, I am delighted to introduce our wonderful panelists, starting with Clive Emery, multi-asset fund manager of Invesco's Summit Responsible range. Next up, we have Sonia Lord, who is the CIO of Legal & General Investment Management, with a focus on leading the group's responsible investment strategy. And last, but by no means least, we welcome Lloyd McAllister, the head of ESG research at Newton Investment Management. Good morning and welcome to you all. Before we kick off, I wanted to remind all of you watching that this is your chance as today's would-be fourth panelists to ask these industry experts your burning questions. This can be done via Slido, and time depending, we will try and get through as many as possible. So, to the first question. Given we are in the first week of a post-COP26 world and you are all experts in this field, I feel it would be remiss of me not to ask you what you think are the key takeaways for our industry. Let's start with you, Clive.
Good morning, and Anna, thank you for both hosting this event and for welcoming us so warmly. Look, I think the takeaways for me for COP was the demonstration of urgency, both by global regulators and politicians, but also by the public, and the focus that everyone has. And I think it also demonstrated that trying to deliver on net zero is complex and is often difficult to get global cohesion, as we saw at the end conclusion with the role of coal and the influence of China and India. But what I would take away is much more positively was that this was the focus of climate and finance. And I think over the last few months, we have seen the most incredible acceleration in terms of financial organizations aligning themselves at the beginning of that journey, to be honest, but it is an incredibly important journey. And just to give you some indications, because I think the scale of the numbers is mind-blowing. The Net Zero Asset Manager group, which has been set up, started at the beginning of this year with 30 signatories. Today, we've moved that up to 220 signatories. That is a huge component. If I look at the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is mainly insurance businesses, we've seen that move from an opening group of 33 signatories at the end of 2019. That's now included 61 signatories with over 10 trillion in assets. And even more amazingly, the Net Zero Banking Alliance has seen an increase from the initial signatories that we had back in April 21. This is very recent, So only sort of 6 months down the line, we started with 43. That's now increased to 95 banks across 39 countries. They own $66 trillion of assets. And to put that into context, that's 43% of all global banking assets. And the pledges that have been made by that list of organizations is to ensure that their lending practices, their investment products will all be net zero aligned by 2050. I describe it as an escalator. Everyone's basically said we're going to get to 2050. Some people will build the escalator more quickly. Some people will get it on more fast. Some people will crank it up and want to get there in 2030 and 2040. But the amount of people who've said we're going to build the escalator to get there is phenomenal. So I look at the success of COP as actually the integration of the commercial sphere rather than just, as we saw from COP19, the regulatory sphere. This is really bringing some of those global commitments into real sort of practical pledges, and then we're going to see that develop over the next couple of years with the focus of our asset managers and asset owners and banks.
Brilliant, thank you. Lloyd, if I may come to you next for your views.
Sure, thank you, Anna, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, I mean, my takeaways from it were, I think what was important was firstly, writing down the root cause of the problem for the first time, which I think is an important step after 26 meetings in 30 years. So writing down that fossil fuels and coal is what needs to be dealt with, I think is hopefully an important step. I sort of echo what Clive said in that if 5 years ago you said to us, we'll have 80% of GDP and 50% of assets under management having net zero plans, you'd have probably bitten their hand off for that outcome. Unfortunately, when you filter those numbers for countries which have actual plans, that number falls to around 10%. And so for me, the big takeaway was that there is still this kind of huge gap to close, and that is going to require a sort of an unusual effort from business as well as governments. And that is going to be a joint effort. And I think that was really emphasized through the government rhetoric came out, which was much more around business taking responsibility for climate change as well as governments. And I think that's a kind of interesting development because business has been really saying, guys, we can't do this without the right regulatory framework to create the right incentives. And so I think it's going to mean there's going to be this ongoing kind of murkiness in who is responsible for driving climate change, and that's going to need a lot more client conversations around what do you want your portfolio to achieve, and that for me was the kind of main outcome.
Thank you. And Sonia?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. Let me add a bit more of a critical voice to my two panelists, because I think, although I fully agree with a lot of the positive tone from both, I think we should not forget that actually in the context of all the headlines, there's actually very few legally binding commitments that would carry enforcement teeth. And I think that's at the end of the day what we are after. And I think amongst the most high profile were the last minute changes from China and India failing to make binding commitments on exiting coal. And I think we hopefully all agree that these were essential in our understanding of how we can actually realistically achieve the net zero targets. To our mind, the second big shortfall of COP26 was, although there were debates, was the lack of a meaningful progress towards carbon pricing, global carbon tax, because to our mind, failing to raise transparency around the cost of the transition will disallow us to incentivize carbon consumers and carbon producers to change their behaviors. And to us, this is an instrumental part of the overall transition. And there was unfortunately not a meaningful progress towards getting there. And I think this is most obvious when we come to, again, the lack of a meaningful transition for the fossil fuel industry. And hence the slight disconnect that we might have between all the very strong commitments from the financial community, from asset managers and from banks. But if we look at the necessary transition for the who currently have 80% of the global 80% share of the global energy mix, then we should not forget that the majority of global oil and gas and coal is produced by state-owned companies and state-controlled companies. And as such, obviously, the impact that the financial services industry can have on these countries and companies, I think realistically is limited. And hence the failure to get these countries to the table and to really articulate a clear transition plan for the industry is a clear missing element of COP, and obviously brings me back to the measurement of the carbon price, because that clearly would incentivize people to put in place the necessary changes. That brings me to the last point around measurement and fairness, because again, both Clive and Lloyd spoke around obviously the need for political and regulatory frameworks. And again, there was a very clear conflict on display at COP26. I think the Indian Minister of Energy said it quite nicely, because he said, why should India forego the fossil fuel-based economic growth that Europe and the US have enjoyed over the last century and a half? So there's a clear focus on fairness of the transition. And again, not enough meaningful progress has part of the trigger why both India and China kind of pulled out last minute on the exiting of coal. But it's very clear that we have not made enough meaningful progress on the idea of measurement and fairness. And measurement, again, we look very often at the territorial carbon production rather than carbon consumption, because what would need to happen is that imports and the embedded carbon in imports theoretically should be added to a country's carbon footprint in order to have a fair assessment of the carbon consumption, and again, in order to really foster the necessary change in our behaviors as consumers and then the necessary changes in behavior of producers. And just let me finish in saying that, again, in summary, I think everything that I've just said just points to the fact that climate change is a global problem. And what we are lacking is, I think, the acceptance, this being a global problem, and that hence global collaboration is clearly not where it needs to be in order for us to successfully tackle climate change.
Brilliant. Thank you to you all. And now we've identified the complexities of that broader backdrop, I think it's time to delve deeper into the idea of responsible companies, perhaps picking up on some of those themes of measurement, fairness, transparency. But first, I'd really like to start with, how do you define responsible? Because, you know, there's not a common terminology in the industry, and I think it's very important that we kind of clearly define from the outset what we're meaning when we use that term. And how does this play out in practice when identifying investment opportunities? Lloyd, I'd like to start with you, if I may.
Sure, Anna. So yeah, as you say, it's clearly a very broad term, and I also think it's one that's evolving over time. But for us, it's about incorporating ESG analysis into our research process so that we're investing with our eyes wide open, fully understanding what we're owning in terms of a company's impacts, its practices and governance structure, etc. The reason that's important is that we know how a company interacts with its key stakeholders can impact cash flows and valuations and volatility. And so for us, it's about understanding the company's impact on society so that we're being a responsible steward of our clients' capital. I think more broadly, we are seeing that definition evolve, and it's evolving in a way that recognizes that the capital markets are just part of a broader system that sits within society, then that sits within our natural environment, and that these systems are interlinked. And therefore, investors were basically being asked to proactively consider these systemic issues in our individual company investment decisions. And that's this kind of evolution that's happening around ESG and sustainability and responsible investing that we're seeing at the moment. And that comes through conversations with regulators and with clients. And it's unclear at the moment. But for us, the way that we've defined it, we've tried to have it very cleanly defined as understanding and incorporating the ESG considerations within our investment processes. And that's how we've defined it.
Brilliant. And Clive, would you like to step onto the stage and talk about your own definitions and if they interlink?
No, I think the question, Anna, is probably the most pressing, because I think if we look from the other end of the spectrum, from the regulated approach with the clear indications, as Sonia indicated, trying to get global agreement on a carbon tax is, we can't even get the people to agree at some point to slowly abate, let alone to agree on a unified pricing. So I wish that was that hope would be deliverable, and maybe in the future it will be. But I think pragmatically speaking, what we've seen is a lot of a good step forward. But what we've seen on the responsible investing side, and the UK is a great example, less than 10% of assets are aligned to responsible investing products. And yet when you do surveys, 70, 80, 90% of people are indicated are interested in sustainable investing. And I think we always used to say, put your money where your mouth is, but I think we're moving to a world where you need to put money where your heart is. And at the moment, that isn't being done. And I think one of the biggest issues that the industry faces is the communication of these very complex and sophisticated issues, which are multifaceted, and they're not necessarily black or white. But one of the problems is that the industry uses interchangeable language: sustainable, ethical, responsible, impact, SRI. Different firms mean different things to it. And I think what we've seen, I think is an amazingly positive step forward from the FCA with Madishu's Treasury, is on the SDR approach, the Sustainable and Disclosure Regulation, with the view of creating some labels. Now, I'm not a massive fan of labels per se, but I do think setting the spectrum of responsible investment products is really crucial. And what do I mean by that? I think the way that it's been set out is traditional funds, responsible, sustainable, and impact funds, with maybe a category or two within sustainable, but basically setting out a roadmap. Because in my view, talking to a client about their interests and their morals is such a difficult conundrum for an advisor. I've spoken to many advisors over the last few months. One even indicated that they started that conversation and the response was that they had a great interest in donkey sanctuaries. It's pretty difficult to match that need and desire from an end client to an investment product. And one of my problems is that opening up a conversation as broad as what do you care about in your morals and your ethics and your views leads to an outcome that's very difficult to satisfy as an advisor. And for me, setting up some commonality in labeling, where you will then be able to, like at the moment, an advisor can differentiate between a property fund and an equity fund and a fixed income fund and active funds and passive funds. We can set up a spectrum of responsibility. And if you are able to delineate what a responsible fund is, what the pros and cons of a sustainable funds are, and what the benefits and drawbacks are of impact funds, and those are clear, you will be able to have a conversation with an end client saying there are traditional funds, which only are looking at risk and return, clearly incorporating ESG, but only for a financial outcome. And then you have these three other components. Do any of those criteria or those areas interest you? Because I think that's aiding the advice journey and aiding people to be able to start the conversations. My view is, in the surveys we've done at Invesco, and I've seen in numerous other surveys, there is a view that SRI products have been avoided because they're complex, they're difficult to explain, they have a different risk and return profile, but so thank you, but no. And the AUM ties into that. Trying to get from the 60 to 80 to 90% of clients who are interested in this approach to add weight of capital so that we have greater effectiveness, as Lloyd described, in terms of effective stewardship of our assets, needs the assets to flow to these products. So actually defining what is a responsible investment, and not my view, not Lloyd's or Sonia's view, the industry's view, so that it is transferable, that we have to comply to it, that everyone else has to comply to it, and it's easily explained to a client, I think is an incredibly crucial stage. If I look at Europe, SFDR, they describe it as Article 8 and Article 9. And that means what to any person on the street. Clients don't understand what ESG is, let alone what Article 8 and Article 9 are. The way and the approach of the FCA is to try to make it easily understandable from the end consumer. And I think that is the perspective we need to keep and contain. And I think the approach they're making is really fantastic. And I hope that everyone on this call looks at the discussion paper that's out and factors into it, because the FCA are very open to colluding and to collaboration to try to bring out what is industry best practice. So I would really ask everyone to be involved. It's our industry, yours and ours, and shaping it for the future, I think, is crucial. So, and I'll turn it back there. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the first time I've heard of a donkey sanctuary request, but we are hearing similar sentiments to you. Sonia, perhaps I could turn to you for your views.
Yes, thank you. And echoing a lot, obviously, what Lloyd and Clive have just said, because it's very clear if you speak to N clients, you probably ask 10 clients and get 10 different views and definitions of what responsible stands for and how they would like this to be reflected in an investment portfolio. And so to us at Elgin, it's about transparency, what we are looking for within companies, transparency, how this is then feeding through the research process, and then last but not least, how this is reflected in responsible investment products. And this transparency really is around a far more holistic and broader picture of a company. I think if you look at what ESG integration actually means, is that you look at a company from a lens that is broader and includes a much broader picture of stakeholders and a company from an angle that tries to capture potential positive and negative externalities. So you're adding a lens that is not just the P&L, the balance sheet and the products of the company, but obviously the entire supply chain and obviously the way the products are produced. And you're starting with the company, you're turning towards the company, and you're requesting a broader set of data points. You're asking for a lens that the company probably hasn't put responsibility as the asset management industry to help with that journey to get there. And as Lloyd has very neatly highlighted, it is then about obviously adding these to the analytical process. So again, you're trying to assess a company not only on the basis obviously of the strength of the balance sheet and the strength of the P&L, but in the context of these established and understood externalities, because, and this is the big importance, we know that they might influence the future value of the company. And this is, I think, where we're adding this responsible investing idea into the mainstream, into the standard, because it tells me that integrating those findings and that understanding in my analysis will help me to deliver a better risk return profile for my fund. What is important, given that we do not have an industry standard yet, is that a product clearly reflects how this is done and whether actually the fund manager is seeking to achieve a very distinct outcome. This can be SDG alignment, this can be obviously a net zero alignment, climate goals, so that the client has a very clear understanding from start to finish what to expect, and can then decide, and that is very important, whether it fits the client's own view on what responsible or ethical investment should look like.
Great, thank you. And so bearing all of this in mind, when considering what constitutes a responsible company, should there be more emphasis on the business practices or operations, or on the products or services that a company is delivering? And can any company be responsible, or are there any examples which typically wouldn't make the cut? Lloyd, I'd like to come back to you first, if that's okay, from the research perspective.
Yeah, sure. So to us, we try to focus on this word material issues. So what's important, and those material issues can come from the company's supply chain or its own operations or the product impact, so that whole value chain approach. And to sort of bring some examples to life here, you might have a mining company who might be producing copper or nickel, key commodities for the energy transition, but they might have some terrible operational practices around pollution or local community impacts or safety. And these are real world examples that we see, and have chosen to not invest in those specific companies, but instead get access to that commodity through other companies who do have good operational practices, as well as good commodity exposures for the energy transition. And so we look at both. We look at the whole value chain and try to make a judgment, an evidence-based judgment on that. I think on the flip side, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a sustainable recruitment company or a sustainable widget company or something that's not linked to an SDG or sort of some sort of inherently obvious positive business impact from the product. And so for us, if it's a recruitment company that is well governed, looks after its employees well, that for us is kind of a sustainable business model. So long as the fundamentals work and the macro works, there's no reason to not consider that sort of a sustainable business model. And so we kind of try to move away from the definition of a kind of sustainable company just being something that's linked to the SDGs, because you can clearly have very successful long-term business models that are not linked to purely doing education or healthcare or energy transition commodities, those types of things. So we try to make sort of weigh up all of these different factors, the ESG factors, the fundamental factors, the macro factors, and try to make an evidence-based decision on whether or not we think this company is worth investing in or not. And that's the process that we have to go through each time. It's weighing up the products, supply chain, and the operations.
Brilliant, thank you. So Sonia, there we've heard that they need to look at the value chain as a whole, that not all businesses has to be linked to the SDGs. What would your thoughts be?
Yeah, I think it's coming back to that point around transparency. It's clear that sustainability does not mean the same thing in every sector for every company. And it is, as Lloyd said, understanding financial materiality of different ESG factors across sectors and then obviously across companies in order to establish how sustainable, how responsible they are at the current point in time. Very important to understand as well is a company that still needs to change or probably hasn't addressed all the externalities that we found yet can still be a responsible company. We should not forget that the transition is still yet to be completed for a large number of sectors. To illustrate this, let's think about the oil and gas industry. And we know as of today, it is only around 25% of the listed oil and gas sector that is aligned to a net zero outcome by 2050. So does that mean that the remaining 75% are not sustainable? And I think that there we have to be very careful that we are not coming to a premature judgment, because obviously our responsibility as an asset manager, of course, is to engage to make sure that companies can articulate a path towards a sustainable future, and that we as the investors obviously are here to help with that and to stay invested through their journey. That is, to my mind, very crucial, because there has been a lot of debate, particular for the dirtier sectors when it comes to climate change, or how about you simply divest from fossil fuels. That will not change the problem. And as such, it is very important to understand the financial materiality in order to judge different companies against this sector backdrop on where they are in their journey. And you might find companies that are much further behind than others. But that, again, is obviously the opportunity set that is out there for investors. But again, to my mind, it's really understanding, obviously, the areas that still need to change, but could still fit into a responsible portfolio. Now, there is, I guess, more broadly accepted areas like controversial weapons, areas of the coal industry, where I think there's genuine agreement that these could not transform themselves into sustainable companies. Now, controversial weapon manufacturers probably could if they just stop producing what they're doing, but a coal producer will struggle to make transform itself into a sustainable company. But if you ignore, if we put those smaller areas, I think it is really understanding the characteristics of each sector, what of the ESG spectrum really matters for the sector, to then assess each individual company against these.
Thank you. And you made a point there about divestment versus transition. And I know that's a point, Clive, that you like to speak to. So perhaps I can ask you to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just before that, I think there were 3 points I'd like to make. The first is, describing the responsibility of a company and how it is difficult. That's the sort of the focus of taxonomy, which we've seen in Europe. And fortunately, we have the Green Technical Advisory Group in the UK. And I'm very fortunate that my amazing colleague, Elizabeth Gillam, is the only member of the asset management or banking industry on that green taxonomy or technical committee, advising the UK government on what should be considered green and how we should approach it across all industries and aspects. So I will always defer to her for insights on that, because that is obviously developments going forward. But the point you made about transition and whether we're looking at divestment is exactly what Sonia just said. It's like not everyone today is perfect. No one is really aligning to net zero today. We need to get there. It's a journey. It's the escalator we have to get on. And I don't think companies should be punished. This is a personal view for not necessarily being on it today. I think what we need to do is say, if you're not on it and in a certain period of time, if you're not willing to make commitments, well, then you are going to be on the naughty step. And that naughty step is not going to be on the escalator. It's going to be somewhere else, and you're not going to be included, and we're going to have to divest. But it's not today. And this is a very different approach to a number of SRI and impact approaches, which has been to say we'll never invest in oil or gas or certain sectors because they're high emitters. My view is, to solve this problem, you have to approach all emissions and approach it. And I think the great thing for me is that net zero and the development of net zero is a transitionary approach, inclusion on all industries to do better, rather than to just say we won't include you, because I think that's a key component. And the one thing that I pick up with something that Sonia said, which I agree, but also unfortunately disagree with, is that Sonia has said now on a couple of occasions that the focus is about ESG integration and inclusion in terms of risk and return. And I agree with that. However, I think that misses one component, because I think we're now operating in a three-dimensional world. And what do I mean by that? We've lived in a two-dimensional world. Model portfolio theory since 1952 has argued you should look at risk-adjusted returns. That is the risk of your investment contextualizing your return. A 10% investment, the 10% return with lower risk is a better return than a 10% return with higher risk. What I think we now need to understand is that we are being asked to deliver, whether it be ESG or gender diversity or climate, a third component, a third axis. And that third dimension not only is a fiduciary duty for us to deliver, but it is also measurable on a standalone basis. So for net zero, it's going to be focused on your carbon emissions. Are you reducing carbon emissions? Now that is measurable separately. Does it add to your risk or return? Like all things, nothing will be correlated 100% of the time. But if you have three axes, you will be able to contextualize your return and your risk and the level of responsibility, because that level of responsibility will be the third axis, the carbon reduction or the gender diversity. And you will be able to look, because my view is a fund that delivers a 10% return with lower carbon emissions or reduced carbon emissions will be better than a 10% return for a fund that doesn't. And the same way that we contextualize return in terms of risk, we will also be able to contextualize in terms of the level of responsibility. And that, I think, is what we need to describe as 3D investing. Is risk and return important? Yes. Do we need to deliver returns? Yes. Should we be looking at sustainability into how that impacts risk and return? Yes. But should we be looking at it separately and as its own component in addition? Yes. So I think 3D investing and the approach to having a view on all three is really crucial, because I think it enables us to contextualize across three dimensions rather than just staying in two.
Well, 3D investing is something that we at Square Mile are very passionate about as well. In terms of that kind of the kind of three axes and those three dimensions there, Clive, I'd like to lead you in, if I may, into our next question, which is, what is the role of engagement in encouraging companies to maintain their standards and to consistently improve?
Yeah, I think engagement is actually crucial, and Lloyd's mentioned it, and so Sonia. The industry is being, as that third component, we're being moved from the valuers of assets, buy low, sell high, and deliver return, regardless of what you're dealing in, to basically being an engaged stakeholder. When I joined the industry nearly way too long ago, I presumed that, you know, as investors, we discussed with companies and we had an input into what they were doing strategically. And it didn't take long for me to realize that was absolute nonsense. It was a one-way explanation of what the company was doing. And we went, yes, thank you very much, asked a few questions. And then we decided if that was good or bad and whether that would move the share price. The future isn't that. The future is we need to go to the companies and say, I'm sorry, we'd like to know what you're doing, please explain. But in addition, we expect you to be doing X, Y, and Z. And we need to be able to monitor that and review that and check that you are complying with that and committing capital to it so that you're not just making pledges, but you're going to deliver on it, because these are commitments that clients want us to be monitoring as well. And that needs to be done through engagement. So actually speaking, and that's across the entire value chain of engagement, whether that be proxy voting, stewardship, meetings, company management. I also really enjoy the fact that the world of collective engagement is really blossoming. And that is possible because, especially in terms of net zero, we have a common goal. You know, Lloyd and Sonia and I all want our companies that we're invested in to deliver on net zero and to deliver greater carbon reduction. Our interests are aligned. Normally in investment management, one's buying, one's selling, where our interests may not be aligned. But this is not a zero-sum game. Everyone wins because we all have the same collective interest on that area. And that is leading to things like Climate Action 100, having incredible influence in changing the commercial ecosystem of the high emitting sectors that they focus on. And I think that the work that they do should be applauded. And I think currently it's only 150 odd companies globally. In time, there are 17,000 issuers. That's a huge leap that needs to be made. But I think that engagement is a crucial step and one that I'm really pleased to be seeing. It's already done by many companies well. And I think we had 2,500 company meetings on ESG last year. The benefit of having 900 fund managers. But if it was 10 per people, that could be 9,000. So let's be clear, it's still at the bottom rung of the step and can be improved dramatically. But engagement is a crucial stage, and I have no doubt Lloyd and Sonia will agree with that and add their viewpoints as well.
And we are desperate to hear them, but it's very true when they say time flies when you're having fun. So Sonia, I'd like to come to you, but if I could ask you and Lloyd to kind of keep it quite concise, that would be brilliant. Thank you, because I'd like to get in another one at least question. Thank you.
Absolutely, I shall give it a go. And just before I do that, wanted to just add to what Clive just said, because Clive, the good thing is we don't disagree around the 3D investing. The point that I tried to make earlier is that when we kicked off the idea of ESG investing, it was always that clients thought they can either have the impact or the financial returns. And I think we're coming to the knowledge, because of financial materiality, that you can actually, that there's a linkage between the two, and as such, for me, a necessary standard in order to live holistic investment solutions for our clients. And this is where obviously then the engagement piece, in order to understand companies holistically, it is where you really had to move the engagement process to the next level. And just to illustrate this at Algem, what we did is actually we merged our credit research, equity research, and we added our investment stewardship in global research and engagement groups that will focus on specific sectors in order to bring that knowledge together and to establish views on specific sectors and companies that then obviously will inform fund managers in their decision. And I think this is still at the beginning. We will have next year for the first time the say on climate, where it requires a far more detailed understanding of the climate plans that companies will put forward, and hence really requires the knowledge and expertise on our side to critically judge these plans and obviously then transparently vote against or in favor. Because again, to me, engagement is all about transparency with the companies we invest in and obviously with our clients as well. Nothing should happen behind closed doors. And this is why the way we have to obviously look at companies really has evolved in a way that I find incredibly exciting. And I think hopefully for our clients to see the benefit of this, not only obviously within their products, but within the societal impact that we can achieve as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lloyd, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just think there's a kind of obvious tension behind the divestment movement in that if the aim is to divest to increase the cost of capital of the company, the investors who remain behind get the higher return. And so there's that kind of inherent tension. You've seen that with the tobacco industry. And so kind of, I think, clearly engagement is an important part of the system to ensure that feedback loop between investors and management. And so kind of as an example, there's quite a few utility companies who have a thermal coal starting point, and we engaged with one of these thermal coal utility companies to highlight that incoming carbon taxes, decreasing economics of coal, and doing forward-looking projections on that utility profile that they had, the decommissioning profile wasn't fast enough. And through those conversations and challenging management, they could bring forward that decommissioning of coal to 2040 to 2025 and ramp up the spending in renewables. And we don't take credit for that as if it was just us. There was a combination of the regulators, other investors as well pushing it. It's a system change thing. But it's that kind of engagement and challenging and providing feedback to management that creates that change. And so for us, it's an important part of the overall process. But I just think that there does need to be a kind of realism about the extent of change which engagement can create without the right overall regulatory framework. And indeed, if there's very dispersed shareholder bases who each have different views, it's very difficult for companies to come to that kind of consensus view from shareholders. So it's a very useful tool, the engagement piece. I think we just need to be realistic about the extent of change it can create.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm afraid that our time has come to an end. I know, I'm sad too, I really am, because you have such brilliant expertise that I wanted to kind of probe you more on. I would like to say such a huge thank you to our brilliant panelists today, Clive Emery, Sonia Lord and Lloyd McAllister, for taking their time to share their views and expertise on how businesses are evolving to become more responsible. For me, there are a few key takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. Engagement is crucial. Transparency is key, and there's still a very apparent need for consistent and measurable metrics on RA outcomes for consumers today. And a big thank you also to you, our audience. We hope you enjoyed today's event. In terms of the Responsible Pathway series, we're now taking a slight break, but we will be back with a bang on your screens come January the 18th. We look forward to seeing you then, and dare I say it, at this very early stage, we wish you all a wonderful festive season. Thank you.